In the little town of Blue Mesa, folks liked to whisper that there was a woman so tall the men had to tilt their heads back just to meet her eyes. They said she was too strong, too big, too different to ever be loved for real. But one hot summer evening, when the sun was sliding down behind the far-off ridges, a young Apache warrior rode into town, walked straight up to her, and said the one thing Blue Mesa hadn't dared say out loud in 10 long years. "You're not too big. They're just too small to understand you." And from that moment on, Blue Mesa was never as quiet as it used to be. Blue Mesa sat cradled between two red rock ridges that looked like giant hands pressing down on the earth. The sun here didn't just shine. It clung to skin, crawled through cracks in doorways, and woke up again every afternoon. People were used to long, hot evenings that lasted all the way to dusk, to the distant echo of horse hooves, and to the dry wind blowing red dust across every porch in town. Life in Blue Mesa was slow, quiet, and a little worn thin. And in the middle of all that weary living, there was one woman everyone saw but no one dared to get close to. The woman named Nelani. She wasn't the monster the rumors tried to make her into. She was just big. Too big, they said. Too tall. Too strong. Taller than most men by a full head, shoulders broad enough to carry a whole stack of firewood the town's men had to share between 3 of them. Her arms were thick and firm like the trunks of young trees. No one called her ugly, but no one called her beautiful either. They just said she was too much. And that word too followed Nilani like a long shadow for more than 10 years. By day she worked in Old Man Henderson's warehouse, hefting heavy crates other folks needed a cart for. By night she walked back to a small house on the edge of Blue Mesa, a place no one ever visited. Wherever she went, a conversation shrank to a murmur. When she stepped into the saloon, the empty chairs around her seemed to widen in a ring as men quietly got up and moved. She never complained. Never made a scene. She just lowered her head a little, ordered a glass of water, sat in the farthest corner, and left before the night got too deep. Blue Mesa had grown used to seeing her the way you'd see a statue that decided to walk. Something impressive, a little unsettling, and not quite human. They didn't hate her. They just didn't know how to love someone like that. Until that evening. The sun had started to lean, and the shadows of the rock walls stretched long across the road. Nailani was carrying 2 heavy wooden crates when she heard the firm, measured sound of boots coming from the end of the street. Blue Mesa wasn't the kind of place strangers wandered through often, especially in the heat. But the man who was walking toward them brought something with him that made every head turn. He was Apache. Not the kind of Apache the townsfolk liked to trade stories about in hushed voices. He was young, tall, but still not as tall as Nailani. His stance was solid, his face was serious, and his dark eyes seemed to know every shadow in this land. His hair was tied back low with a strip of leather, an old earth-colored bead necklace resting against his chest. He walked straight down the center of town, not glancing left or right, unbothered by the stares that followed him. His name was Koa. He stopped right in front of Nilani. She was surprised, just a little, because no one had stood this close to her in years without taking a step back. He looked up at her, calmly, without fear or judgment. Just the quiet gaze of a man who'd seen things bigger than fear. Nailani shifted to one side so he could pass, but he didn't move. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice roughened by a long day's work. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he said one sentence that dropped over Blue Mesa like a stone. "You're not too big. They're just too small to understand you." Silence hit the town hard. The men in the saloon leaned to the door. Mr. Henderson straightened up behind his crates, eyebrows raised. The butcher's wife stopped her knife in mid-cut. The words were too honest, too direct, and too out of step with the story Blue Mesa had been telling itself for years. Neilani froze, not because she was confused, but because no one had ever spoken to her like that before. She opened her mouth and couldn't find a single word. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and heat, but for a moment everything felt perfectly still. "Who are you?" she finally asked. Koa answered softly, "A man who came at the right time." "Came for what?" "To protect you." Neilani took half a step back. "I don't need anyone to protect me." "I know," Koa said, his eyes holding hers. "But Blue Mesa needs someone to stand beside you." The words tightened something in Neilani's chest. It wasn't pain. It was that feeling she'd spent years avoiding. The feeling of being truly seen. Koa turned his head, looking slowly around the town, measuring the eyes fixed on them. "This town is changing," he said, "and not in a good way. You're standing right in the middle of it." Neilani let out a short breath. "Where did you come from?" "From a place where my people still listen to the wind," he replied. "The wind told me to come." Neilani narrowed her eyes. "The wind didn't say anything to me." "The wind never talks to those who don't need to know," he said, "but it told me you're in danger." Her hands tightened on the wooden crate. "I don't believe that." Koa studied her, slow and steady. "Neilani, you don't have to believe it. You just have to let me stay." That evening, the sun dropped fast, like a blade cutting across the sky. And in that same hour, Blue Mesa watched something they never expected. An Apache warrior choosing to stand beside the woman they'd been calling too big to be loved for as long as anyone could remember. And from that moment on, the fate of both of them began to shift. That afternoon slipped into dusk faster than usual, leaving a thin band of gold clinging to the rock walls around Blue Mesa. Neilani went on carrying crates into the warehouse as if nothing had happened. But every step felt heavier than on any other day. Koa's words kept echoing in her mind like a voice in an old canyon that refused to fade. She set the crate down and stood still for a long moment, trying to steady her breathing. In Blue Mesa, she was used to hearing other kinds of words. Too big, too strong, too different. No one had ever told her she wasn't wrong for being exactly who she was. She gave her head a small shake, as if she could toss those words off her shoulders. But they stayed there, clinging like the dust of this town. When she stepped out of the warehouse, the heat had finally let go. The main street stretched almost empty, except for the Apache man leaning against a post in front of the saloon. Koa wasn't watching her. He was looking at the sunset, as if the last light of day were having a quiet conversation with him. But as she walked past, he called her name, his voice not loud, just clear enough that she had to stop. "Neilani." She turned, a hint of caution in her eyes, but not quite cold. He walked toward her, his steps slow and steady. Though he was shorter than she was, he never once seemed small. That was strange. Men in Blue Mesa usually shrank into themselves when they stood too close to her. Koa said just one thing. "I want to know you get home safe." Neilani was silent a few seconds before she answered. "I can take care of myself." Koa nodded slightly, not arguing. "I know." That answer threw her off more than a protest would have. People usually told her she didn't need to be that strong, or asked why she couldn't be more like other women. He didn't. Nailani asked, "Why do you worry about me at all?" Koa held her gaze long enough that she had to glance away. "Because something in Blue Mesa is changing. The men in this town aren't just whispering anymore." She knew what he meant. She'd seen those looks, not just curiosity, the tight, restless eyes of men who felt she didn't fit inside the little world they'd built for themselves. "I'm used to it," she said. Koa answered softly, "I'm not used to watching someone walk alone when they don't have to." Those words stole her breath for a heartbeat. It wasn't flattery. It sounded like a simple fact. And sometimes the truth can weaken a person more than any compliment. Nailani turned away and started toward the edge of town. Koa fell in behind her, a few paces back, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to disappear. "You planning to follow me like this every time?" she asked, without looking over her shoulder. "I'm walking the same way you are. Every road in Blue Mesa leads back to my house." Koa's voice dropped low, steady like packed earth. Then I'd say fate wants me walking the same way as you." Nailani stopped. She turned and looked at him straight on, no more avoiding his eyes. "You don't know me." "Not yet," Koa said, "but I will. Just that. Nothing more." And that little bit stirred her heart more than anything had in years. Simple words, spoken without the slightest tremor just because she was bigger than he was. No flinching, no trying to prove anything. They walked on until the town ended and the desert began. Her house sat under a tall pine bent sideways by years of wind. When they reached it, she said, "From here I can get the rest of the way alone." Koa nodded. "I know." She waited for him to say something else, something too big or too much, but he didn't. He just stood there long enough to see for himself that she was safe, that her hand was on the door. Then he spoke the last words of that evening. "Tomorrow I'll still be here." It wasn't a promise and it wasn't a plea. It was a simple statement. Like some part of him understood she needed someone to stand on her side, even if she'd never said it out loud. Nailani didn't answer, but when she stepped into the house, her heart did not close the door behind her. And in the dark of Blue Mesa, something began to shift. Not in the place where she lived, but in the place where she'd been hiding her heart for far too many years. The next morning, sunlight fell over Blue Mesa in a soft gold, like oil brushed across old wood. The town woke up slow as always, but the rumor about the Apache man standing beside Nailani was already moving faster than the wind. Folks lingered in front of the saloon, staring toward her little house at the edge of town, whispering that she was dragging trouble her way. They didn't understand that trouble had never needed her help. It always found her on its own, drawn to the difference they refused to understand. Nailani hoisted an empty crate onto Mr. Henderson's handcart. She worked the heavy jobs like she always did, but her breathing wasn't as steady as other days. Each movement was just a little out of rhythm. Not because the work was harder, but because she knew someone was out there in this town who saw her differently than anyone ever had. When she turned the corner by the market, she saw him at the far end of the street. Koa didn't walk up to her. He just stood where he was, at a distance that let her feel his gaze without feeling watched. He looked at her the way a man might look at the first sun after a long night, without judgment, without pity, with the quiet steadiness of someone who understands more than he says. Her feet carried her toward him before she could decide if she wanted that. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," Koa answered softly. "You don't know if I wanted that or not." He glanced at the big hands wrapped around the crate she was carrying. "I don't think you've ever wanted anyone standing beside you for too long, but I'm still here." Nailani didn't answer right away. There was something in his voice that opened a small space inside her, just wide enough for a little light to slip in, not wide enough yet to trust completely. Strangers could come easily. Staying beside a woman like her was another matter. "Blue Mesa is not kind to people like you," she said. Koa's eyes went to the distant ridges. "It wasn't kind to someone like you first." Nailani lowered her head a little. "I'm used to it." "You're used to them being afraid of you," he said quietly. "You're not used to someone choosing to stand with you." Those words weren't meant to comfort. They were simply true, and the truth has a way of making a person weaker than pain ever does. Nailani lifted her gaze, her dark eyes open and honest. "Why do you stand with me?" Koa didn't hesitate. "Because you shouldn't have to stand alone." The simple answer sent a heat up her spine, like she'd stepped into the strongest sun of the day. She almost argued, wanted to say she was strong enough, big enough, different enough to walk alone for the rest of her life. But when she opened her mouth, she caught his eyes. He wasn't looking at her because she was large or powerful. He was looking at her like he could see the woman she'd once been before they convinced her she wasn't worth loving. She turned away so she wouldn't have to hold that gaze too long. "I don't want the Apache getting into trouble because of me." "Apache don't fear trouble," Koa murmured. "Blue Mesa will say you're crazy." He dipped his head just a little. "Let them. They've said things like that about you for years." She walked back toward the warehouse and his footsteps followed. They should have bothered her. They didn't. Truth was, that morning they made it a little easier to breathe. When they reached the warehouse door, Mr. Henderson came out and blocked the way. The old man had never cared for outsiders, especially not Apache. Arms folded across his chest, he stared Koa up and down. "What do you want here?" Koa stayed quiet for a few seconds, glancing toward Nailani as if to see whether she wanted him to answer. She didn't say a word. "I'm standing near someone this town has treated wrong," Koa said simply. Henderson snorted. "You here to protect her?" "No," Koa replied. "She protects herself. I'm just standing on the right side." Silence dropped over them, thicker than the dust in the air. Henderson drew in a long breath and finally stepped aside. He didn't say anything, but it was clear Koa had just cracked a wall Blue Mesa had built around Nailani for years. When the work was done, Nailani spoke under her breath. "You plan on following me all day." Koa tilted his head, the sunlight catching in his dark eyes. "I follow the wind. The wind brought me to you. If you want me here, I'll stay. And if I don't want you here..." He said something that sent her heart a little offbeat. "Then I'll still be here, until the day you don't have to stand alone anymore." Nailani didn't answer, but when she turned away, her lips trembled just a little in a way she didn't understand herself. She didn't want to admit it, but she heard that sentence the way a thirsty person hears water after years of nothing but sun and dust. Blue Mesa still had a lot that hadn't changed. But one thing had started to shift. Not the town. Her heart. For the first time in many years, she wasn't standing entirely inside the shadow of herself. Evening falls faster in Blue Mesa than folks expect. The sun isn't all the way down yet, but the town has already changed color, covered in shadows from old rooftops and low red dust sliding along the main road. Today, Nailani can feel something different in the air. Not anger exactly, more like a quiet tension. Small towns sometimes go silent in a way that lets you know something is about to happen. She's locking the warehouse door when she hears firm footsteps behind her. 3 men from town are walking toward her. No smiles, no lazy greetings like on other days. Their eyes don't carry that old, sidelong avoidance anymore. This time it's the look of men who feel like their territory has been disturbed. One of them says, "Heard you've got yourself a new friend?" Nailani doesn't answer. She just stands straight, silent, like a rock set in the path of the wind. The second man says, "Blue Mesa's no place for Apache, and no place for troublemakers either." The third tips his chin at her. Sees especially when he only stands next to one person. You. The silence that falls after that is heavy as iron. She's not the kind of woman who scares easy, but she understands how dangerous this can get. Not because these men are strong, but because small people sometimes do things bigger than they realize. She says slowly, "I'm not looking for trouble." The first man smirks. "Yeah? Trouble's looking for you." Right then, another pair of footsteps rolls up the street. Koa appears at the far end, his Apache coat catching the last of the light. He walks toward them without hurry, without puffing himself up. He doesn't need to. Just being there is enough to make all 3 men go still. He looks at them, then at Nailani. His voice is low, but it shifts the air. Something wrong in Blue Mesa. One of the men mutters, "We're just talking." Koa answers, "Doesn't look that way from here." They don't reply. That quiet tells him everything he needs to know. He steps closer and comes to stand beside Nailani. He doesn't touch her, but there's only enough space between them for the wind to slide through. That alone is enough to make the 3 men edge back half a step. Koa asks her softly, "You all right?" Nailani nods. "I'm all right." Koa looks back at the men. "Then I figure this conversation is finished." The 3 of them glance at each other, then back off without another word. They leave like shadows sliding off a wall, and when they're gone, the street feels bigger, quieter. Only then does Nailani let out a slow breath. Not because she'd been afraid, but because she realizes Koa's stillness at her side brought a kind of calm she hasn't felt in years. She's the first to speak. "You didn't need to step in." "I know," Koa says, "but you did anyway." He watches her for a moment, like he wants her to hear this clearly, because even the strongest person shouldn't always have to stand alone. The words soften something in her chest she didn't know was tight. She looks down at her big hands, the ones that have made people uneasy for as long as she can remember. Hands Koa has never flinched from. "Blue Mesa doesn't like people like me," she says quietly. "Then I'll like you enough for the whole town," he answers. Her eyes lift, widening just for a heartbeat. It isn't a love declaration. It isn't a promise. It's like a breeze running through a line of trees, not loud, but enough to make the leaves tremble and break the stillness she's carried inside for so long. She asks, "Why do you do this?" "Because I see you," Koa says. "Other people see me." He shakes his head. "No. They see your size. I see who you are." A long silence settles between them, the kind that's strangely beautiful. Nailani feels something like a small underground spring open up inside her after a long drought. Not roaring, not rushing, but enough to change the land just beneath the surface. She whispers, "Thank you." Koa answers, "If you want me here, I'll stay. Tomorrow, and the days after." Nilani watches the last light fall over Blue Mesa. I don't know what I want yet. Koa tilts his head, his gaze softer than the evening sun. Then I'll wait. Just 3 words. But for a woman who's been called too big to be loved all her life, they're the gentlest thing she's ever heard. And for the first time, in this dusty little town, Nilani feels like she might not be the only one who's been looking at things from the wrong angle. Night settled over Blue Mesa without a fuss. It came down quiet, like the surface of a small pond after rain, so still you could hear footsteps on the dusty road. Nilani's house sat out on the edge of town under a leaning old pine, its light a small, soft glow in the dark. Inside, she sat on a worn wooden chair, big hands laced together, palms warm because her mind wouldn't stop turning. All her life she'd kept people at arm's length, but today, when Koa stood in front of her, when he bent his knees to look her straight in the eye and didn't react like she was some towering wall to get around, something in her chest changed tempo. It wasn't some wild, sudden flutter. It was the quiet, steady feeling of having finally found something. A soft knock came at the door. Not loud, not urgent. The kind of knock from someone who doesn't want to startle you. Nilani rose and opened it. Koa stood on the porch. Moonlight laid silver across his shoulders. "Why are you here this late?" she asked. "I wanted to know you're all right," he said. She leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, her eyes gentler than she usually let them be. "You don't have to worry about me all day." Koa held her gaze. "I'm not worrying," he said. "I'm being here." The words pulled tight at something inside her, not with pain, but with that unfamiliar tug a lonely heart feels when it suddenly has to make room for someone else. She stepped aside and let him in. The house was plain. One table, a few chairs, a small cabinet. But when Koa walked through the doorway, the room felt bigger somehow, as if his presence filled in all the empty corners. She sat by the window. "You said the town is changing. You really think I'm in danger?" Koa took the chair across from her, fingers laced, voice slow and steady. "Not because they're stronger than you," he said, "because their fear is bigger than their sense." Nilani glanced out at the pine swaying in the faint wind. "I've lived with their fear my whole life. I thought I was used to it." "You're used to enduring it," Koa replied. "You're not used to being chosen." That made her blink, slower than usual. "And why do you care so much about that?" He looked straight at her, eyes carrying the weight of all the seasons he'd already walked through. "Because I see you while Blue Mesa only sees your size." Her fingers brushed the tabletop. "You haven't known me long enough to say that? I only need to know what my heart understood the first time I saw you," he said softly. Silence stretched between them. Not awkward, not empty. Just the quiet of two people who had finally found words after years of talking only to their own loneliness. Then she asked the question she'd carried for years and never dared to say out loud. "Why me?" Koa's answer was the gentlest line he'd ever spoken. "Because no one's ever stood on your side," he said. "And I want to be the first." Nilani's eyes softened, deep and quiet as water. Not because she was weak, but because she finally let the door inside her swing open. She stood and walked toward him, stopping when they were close enough to hear each other breathe. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted. Koa looked at her like she was the truest thing he'd ever seen. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just let me stay." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she opened them again, the guard was gone. No more bracing, no more flinching from what she wanted. only the simple acceptance that even the strongest person has the right to be loved without asking anyone's permission. Her voice came quiet but clear. "If you want, you can stay." Koa nodded. He didn't grin, didn't make a show of it, but there was a light in his eyes Nailani had never seen in anyone's before. "I'll stay," he said. Out on that still blue mesa night, with the wind moving past the little house like a blessing, something small and enormous happened at the same time. A woman once called too big to be loved finally found someone who saw the true size of her heart. And the Apache man beside her didn't stand there to guard a powerful body. He stood there as a kind of home, the place where her heart could finally rest. In that moment, they both knew. Happiness hadn't come because they fit anyone else's idea. It had come because, in a town that never understood them, they had chosen each other. Blue Mesa is still a small town pinned between two red rock ridges. The wind still moves through it the way it always has, carrying dust and the slow breath of time. But ever since the night Nailani let Koa step into her little house on the edge of town, the place hasn't been quite the same. Folks have started to look at her a little longer, less like they're bracing for something, more like they're trying to understand a person they'd misjudged for years. She's still strong, still taller than every man on the street, still walking the dusty road with that long, steady stride that once made everyone step aside. But something has changed in the way she holds herself, in the way she greets the morning, in the way her eyes rest on the world. And when Koa walks beside her, there's a quiet calm around them, like two pieces of land that have always belonged together, finally admitting it. For Koa, Blue Mesa isn't just a hard little town at the edge of nowhere anymore. It's the place where, every evening, he sees Nailani's broad shoulders under the fading light and knows he chose the right person, in the right place, at the right time. Some loves don't begin with grand speeches or fireworks. They start with a few simple words. "I'm here." Sometimes that's all it takes to turn a whole life in a new direction, and to teach a town to love what it used to fear. If this story let your heart soften, even just a little, stay with us out here on these windy western nights by hitting subscribe to Tales from the Wild West. Tap like, leave a comment, and share so these quiet, warm stories don't get lost in the red dust. And don't forget to ring the bell so every new journey finds its way back to you, from somewhere just beyond those far-off hills.